Chapter 4. If the village of Nottingham had seemed worse for the years, the king's castle looked better than ever, Marian decided, as they made their final approach up the steep hill to reach its powerful front gates. Its once weather-worn gray stone walls were now shining white, as if they had been bleached, and colorful flags flew confidently from the castle's many turrets, looking brand new and not yet battered from brutal English storms. The water in the castle moat sparkled in the sunlight, so clear she could see the colorful fish swimming beneath the surface, and the grand drawbridge lowered majestically as if on its own, like a giant mouth yawning. The carriage rolled over the bridge, under the well-oiled portico, and into the castle courtyard, which was buzzing with activity. Rhinoceros soldiers were practicing archery in one corner, and elephant blacksmiths were hammering out shiny armor and sharp weapons in another. A few rambunctious tiger cubs ran around the carriage, waving wooden swords and shouting for it to stop in the name of Prince John. Sons and daughters of nobility, Marian assumed, well-fed and richly dressed. Her mind flashed back to little Tagalong's big hollow eyes, and she felt a pang in her gut. "Looks like the taxes are helping someone," she muttered to herself. As the carriage pulled to a stop, the iron gates behind them slammed shut with a loud clang. Marian and the sheriff exited their coach, stepping down onto a perfectly paved cobblestone path that led straight to the castle's front door. A crocodile dressed in a red robe and matching flouncy hat approached them, bowing low. "Milady," he said in a crackling voice, I am so glad you have arrived safely. Your trip was smooth, I hope?" "It was, thank you." "Very good, milady. Now, if you would please come with me, the prince eagerly awaits you in his throne room." Marian nodded, trying to keep her composure even as her heart began to beat faster. It was one thing to think about Prince John as king in an abstract sense, quite another to step into the old, familiar throne room and see him sitting on her uncle's throne. "Thank you," she said, working to keep her voice neutral. "I am honored he has made time to meet with me. And I assume my things will be sent to my new rooms? I am rather exhausted from the long journey and could do with a hot bath after meeting with His Majesty." "Of course," the crocodile agreed. "The prince has set you up in your old chambers, the same ones you had as a child," he smiled toothily. "That is very gracious of him," she said, though she wondered if this was actually a kindness. After all, the rooms she'd had as a child were small and located in a tower, some distance away from the main halls of the castle. Fine for a young orphan fox, but certainly not what a grown lady, not to mention a new member of the king's council, would typically command. But maybe Prince John was just hoping to help her feel at home, she told herself. And in truth, with so much having changed, she was grateful for any familiarity. She turned back to the crocodile. "I'm ready to meet with the prince. Please lead the way." The crocodile nodded and motioned for her to follow him. Marian started to do so, then stopped, realizing the sheriff had fallen into step behind them. She frowned, turning to face him. "Thank you for escorting me to the castle, Sheriff," she said in her politest voice, one that she hoped left no room for argument. "But as you can see, I am now in good company, and I would hate to be the cause of your neglecting any of your very important duties." The sheriff's mouth dipped into an unhappy frown. Clearly, he didn't appreciate being dismissed so abruptly, but all he said was, "Of course, milady," in a slightly sneering tone. "I'll leave you to it, then. As you said, I have much to do." And with that, he turned and stormed back towards the carriage. Marian sighed, watching him go. "What a miserable wolf," she mused. "Who would have ever thought he'd make a good sheriff? Never mind a collector of taxes. She would have to discuss this with the council once she was properly seated. In the meantime, she followed the guard into the castle and down a long stone corridor that dead-ended at a pair of ornate bronze doors Marian knew opened into the throne room. It was a room she was very familiar with. She'd played there countless times as a small child on the floor beneath her uncle's and aunt's thrones. But as she stepped into the room now, she had to stop herself from gasping out loud. The throne room had been completely transformed, so much so that she barely recognized it. It was no longer the stark yet elegant chamber of her uncle, King Richard, who had always declared that simplicity and humbleness were the true hallmarks of power. Now it was a showcase of luxury and excess, with richly woven tapestries draping the walls and thick woven rugs covering the floors. Even the architect had changed. Where once Richard's throne had sat at the same level as his subjects, so the king could meet with them eye to eye, it was now raised into a newly constructed platform at the far end of the room, only reachable by several steps. And that wasn't all. The throne was surrounded by large chests, overflowing with gold and jewels, a treasure trove so large it spilled out onto the floor. Marian bit her lower lip, trying to imagine what Richard would say if he'd walked into this vainglorious chamber. He'd be horrified, disgusted. It was everything he had always despised about the monarchy. But Richard wasn't here anymore. This was Prince John's realm now, and she was getting a very bad feeling things were worse than she'd feared. Trumpets sounded and the door in the back opened. A moment later, a tall but lean lion, dressed in a crimson robe hemmed in pure white ermine, stepped into the room. He wore a crown made of gold and jewels that appeared rather too large for a smallish head. When he caught sight of Marian, he grinned wildly, revealing large white lion fangs. "Maid Marian!" he exclaimed. "Finally, you're here! I was getting so dreadfully bored waiting for your arrival." He yawned loudly as he headed up the steps to his throne, sweeping a few jewels off the seat before plopping himself down on top of it. Marian drew in a breath. "It was a long journey," she admitted, "but I am glad to have arrived, even under such tragic circumstances." Her eyes rose to a portrait of King Richard on the wall, and her heart ached all over again. It didn't feel right, being back at the castle in the throne room itself, and not seeing her uncle on the throne, like her world had been tipped upside down with no way to right it again. Prince John followed her gaze, the crown slipping from his head and falling over one eye. He pushed it back irritably before giving it a deep sigh. "Yes," he agreed, "my poor, poor brother. It is an unimaginable loss for the kingdom, and for those of us who loved him." He sniffled loudly, reaching into his robe for a handkerchief to dab his eyes. "First Mummy, now my dear brother," he moaned loudly, almost too loudly for the empty room. "Tell me, how much grief should one handsome young lion be forced to bear?" He plugged his thumb into his mouth and began to suck it hard, looking quite forlorn. Marian resisted the urge to raise an eyebrow at the dramatic display. But then, everyone grieved differently, she reminded herself. Prince John's world had also been turned upside down. "I can't begin to imagine how you must be suffering," she said slowly, "and if there's anything I can do, any way I can help, well, please know that I am here for you. We are family, after all," she added, wondering, even as she said it, if he still considered her so. Prince John nodded, unplugging his thumb from his mouth. "Yes," he said, "family. I have so little family left, so very few who understand how hard I work for the kingdom." Not that anyone appreciates all my sacrifices, he added mournfully. Why, I work my paws to the bone for this kingdom, and all the animals do is whine and moan and openly act out against me. He scowled. You'd think they'd be grateful for all I've done for them. I am their king, after all. Marian thought back to her trip through Nottingham. The boarded-up shops, the hungry rabbits, the sheriff's boasts about collecting taxes and keeping the animals in line. It was no wonder no one respected the new law of the land. But then maybe John didn't know, she rationalized. A king depended on his advisors and officials. Maybe he had no idea what was really happening on the ground. You know, I stopped in Nottingham on the way to the castle, she said cautiously, hoping she wasn't overstepping her bounds. But she was to be a member of the king's council, and Richard had always lectured his council on the importance of speaking the truth. And I have to tell you, she said, they don't seem to be doing very well. The prince frowned, looking confused. What do you mean by that? He asked, his voice holding a thread of suspicion. It's just, well, they seem hungry, she said, deciding to go for it, like they don't have enough to eat, and the town is in such disrepair. I hardly recognized it. And then there's the shops. Half of them are shuttered for unpaid taxes. John opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, a new voice rose from the back of the room. Well then, perhaps they should have paid their taxes.